All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Free Kiwis. We're delighted to be back after something of a long break, and we're especially delighted to have with us today Iona Italia, who has recently been announced as the Managing Editor of Quillette. So congratulations, Iona, and welcome to Free Kiwis.
Thank you.
S-
Thank you.
So is it
Lovely to see you again.
Good to see you? So this is kind of a simple but complicated question, maybe even more complicated for you than it is for me. Where are you from, Iona?
Oh, yes, that is a complicated question.
I thought asking questions like that was a microaggression.
Oh, I apologize for the micro or macro aggression.
Yeah, I've never thought of it as a microaggression, but there was a long period of my life when that question made me quite uncomfortable. And I was never sure whether to get into the weeds about it or to give a simplistic explanation. But whenever I gave a simple explanation, I ended up getting called out on it. So I would say that I was from Scotland, and then people would say, "But whereabouts in Scotland are you from?" And I just have no idea how to answer that. So I would make something up, like say, "I'm from Edinburgh." And then they would say, "Oh, which school did you go to in Edinburgh? And whereabouts did you live in Edinburgh?" And of course, I've never really lived in Edinburgh, and I have never been to school there. Um, okay, so the more longer, more complicated version is my mother was Scottish and my father he was, I believe, born in India, long before partition in the 1920s. I think he must have been born. And he went up to Pakistan at some time, probably in the 60s, and probably because he was working for the Parsi company Tata. And my mom and dad they met in London and then they moved to Pakistan in 1968. I was conceived there and then I was born in the UK, but went immediately back to Pakistan as a babe in arms. My mother gave birth in the UK, so I'd have British citizenship. Um, but I immediately went back to Pakistan where I spent my early childhood. And then so around 1979, I went back to the UK. Um, and after that, I grew up in various places in the UK, mostly at boarding school, just outside London. So my father's background is Indian Parsi, and it is patrilineal. So I do consider myself to be a Parsi also. And the Parsis are the Zoroastrians of India. They reputedly emigrated from Iran, fleeing from persecution during the Islamization of Iran towards the end of Muhammad's lifetime and just after Muhammad's lifetime. So it's sort of eighth century um, to Gujarat, and they settled in India, where now they are a tiny, tiny ethnic minority. About half of them live in Bombay, and the other half live in the diaspora. And when I was growing up in Pakistan, I was living in a gated Parsi community, a Parsi Bagh in Karachi. So there you go.
So is Zoroastrianism is that still adhered to by a majority of Parsi?
Well, adhere to, I would say that yes, most Parsis are culturally Zoroastrian. We are very similar to Jews in that way. So I think most Parsis would celebrate, for example, our New Year, which is in mid-August. Also, the first day of Persian Spring, which is Persian New Year, not to be confused with Parsi New Year, which is obviously first day of Northern Hemisphere spring. Um, and then a few other festivals, like I recently celebrated Yalda, which is the midwinter festival, which was clearly not winter here in Sydney, but we had it's supposed to be a festival centered around fire, and we had a barbecue. So that was fitting.
Mm-hmm.
And also Zoroaster's birthday and a couple of other dates. But I think that also many Parsis go occasionally to the fire temple, especially on those holidays. We don't have a lot of services in Zoroastrianism. You mostly just go, it's like visiting a shrine. Um, and then I would say that A lot of other Zoroastrian traditions are dying out. For example, the sky burials. So traditionally, Zoroastrians are laid out. The corpses are laid out on the top of a tower of silence, which is like a giant upside down colander, where the flesh is eaten by vultures, and then the bones fall through or are swept by the priest, swept through the slots in to be gradually buried below the tower. So there are still some towers of silence in operation in India. As far as I know, nowhere else in the world. There's some archaeological sites in Iran, Russia, Iraq, and that region. There are some archaeological sites of towers of silence, but none of them are in operation. Only a couple are in operation in India. The main one is in Bombay. And I have been to a traditional Parsi funeral there. But in general, Parsis are just now being buried in cemeteries. I would say that the two couple of things that are really very rigidly adhered to in India. Well, one thing that's very rigidly adhered to in India is that Zoroastrianism is a birth religion. It's an ethno-religion. You cannot convert to Zoroastrianism. You also can't leave. Doesn't matter if you don't believe in God or practice some other religion or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's not about that. It is your identity. And in the West, they are allowing people to convert, and I think this is a very sensible idea. But in India, they're extraordinarily strict about it. You're only a Zoroastrian if your father was a Zoroastrian. If your mother was, but your father was not, you're not. If you're married to one or are the child of a Zoroastrian, you're not. Only if your father was Zoroastrian.
So again, quite similar to Judaism, except that that's matrilineal.
Yeah, you can convert to Judaism.
You can, but they don't really encourage it.
I think just liberal forms
they don't
of
encourage
Judaism,
it,
right?
but you can.
Yeah.
No, you can convert to Orthodox Judaism. Yes, and I think that the Argentine president, Javier Milei, another complication to my identity is I spent many years in Argentina, and I have Argentine citizenship. So our president, Javier Milei, has converted to Orthodox Judaism. He had to be circumcised as an adult. Very unpleasant. He has done that. So yes, you can, but it's a difficult and for men painful process.
I can
but
imagine.
You cannot convert to Zoroastrianism. Not in India. In the West, they are doing it now.
Right. Yeah.
So whose side are you on if you contemplate the Greco-Persian Wars?
Yeah, I've definitely got to be on the Persian side.
I think I teach my students, I used to every year, about the Behistun inscription, which has, I think, Darius, right? And above him there's this sort of winged figure, which I always thought was Ahura Mazda, the god himself, but I think you told me it's sort of a spirit representing Ahura Mazda or something slightly different.
I'm actually wearing it on a necklace.
Oh, yes.
So it's called the Farohar, this symbol. Or at least in Parsi culture, it's called the Farohar. And I don't know if there's really a sort of orthodox, authoritative version of what it is, but what I was taught was that it's a Yazata, so it's a kind of guardian angel, and it's symbolic of Zoroastrianism, but it's not Ahura Mazda himself, and there are no images of Ahura Mazda. Lots of images of Zoroaster, like our prophet is better looking than your prophet. Many images of him. Many. I have one in my bedroom, actually. I have a little picture of Zoroaster in the bedroom. But I don't think that there are images of Ahura Mazda. He is more of an abstract concept.
Now, one of the few things that I know about Zoroastrianism is that it was where Friedrich Nietzsche got the name Zarathustra for his book.
Yes.
Thus Spake
yes,
Zarathustra.
Right.
I don't really know why. Do you know why he chose to do that?
I have no idea. And I don't know anything much about Nietzsche.
Okay. I know much more about Nietzsche than I know about Zoroastrianism, but we'll just have to leave that question.
He was a classical scholar. I think he became professor of Greek at Basel, I think, at something like 26.
Yeah, he was exceptionally young.
Yeah. He might have got into it through that.
Well, he certainly had a very wide range, especially for 19th century European, very wide-ranging knowledge of the world's religions. He wrote about Buddhism, so he no doubt had studied Zoroastrianism as well, but we'll just have to leave the question of why he based Zarathustra on Zoroaster.
Yeah, I think he got some of that from Schopenhauer, who had an interest in Eastern religions as well. Yeah. But anyway,
I think. Sorry, just wanted to say that in the British Museum, that I think it's the Assyrian galleries, are full of sculpture and friezes and things which are exactly the same as the ones we have on the Zoroastrian fire temples in India.
So that's
so all the Assyrian stuff is, to me, Zoroastrian iconography.
So that's Ashur, though, right? That's a predecessor god, isn't it?
Is that Ashur? So there's, for example, there are two. There are often two kind of winged lion-looking figures. Those are called, I would call those lamusas.
Okay.
And those are like gate guardians that are usually, are very often in front of the temples. The way in which at the British Museum itself, when you go to the main entrance, you see two big lions. Instead, at the fire temple, they have two of these winged lions, the lamusas. And there's also this weird looking kind of squished sort of, I can't remember if it's maybe winged pig thing, which is also in the Assyrian gallery. And we have those on the top corners of columns outside the fire temple. A lot of the Assyrian imagery, also the way in which men are depicted with the big hats, those pillar hats, and the kind of beards and the specific profiles, which not only are, you see the same friezes all over the Parsi India, but also in the faces of Parsis I know in India.
Interesting.
So I grew up in Pakistan, and it was a long time before I was permitted to go to India because I used to be a Pakistani citizen. But when I did go to India, before I went, my cousin Zubin told me that he could pick a Parsi out of 1 million Indians. And I just thought this was hyperbole, but after having been, I can see what he means. It's a small gene pool, and I feel there's some very distinctive facial features, and I actually can see them in the Assyrian gallery friezes.
Yeah, I know what you're thinking about.
Characteristic nose.
Yeah, these enormous lion figures with wings that would have been at the entrance gates, maybe from Nineveh or somewhere like that. Anyway, I know what you mean in the British Museum. Yeah, they're very arresting. And then, I mean, I think I sort of introduced Zoroastrianism to my students as part of the lecture on the Persian Empire, and I say, well, Cyrus the Great is the one who sort of popularizes it. But I don't think he was the first. I mean, maybe he was the first great king to espouse it, but it obviously borrowed on a lot of previous traditions. All right, so you mentioned Argentina as well. So, all right, so you grew up mainly in Pakistan, if I got that right, and then how do you end up? And I think you spent time as an academic as well. So how did you get from there via academia to Argentina?
I think I grew up in my very early years in Pakistan and then in the UK.
All right. Oh yeah, you went to boarding school in the UK, right?
Yeah, I grew up, if I had to name one place, I would say I grew up mostly in the UK. How did I get to Argentina? So I danced Argentine tango as a hobby. And in 2006, I got married, and my then husband, Oliver, who I met through tango actually, we both danced as a hobby, and we decided to take a year's unpaid leave and go to Buenos Aires and study tango. He was a neuroscientist, scientific researcher. So we rented out his London flat, which allowed us to live there without having to work for a year. And basically we loved it so much we never came back, but we got divorced 3 years later, and eventually he went back, but I stayed. which seemed like a good idea at the time. And I made a living from 2009 when I got divorced until 2017. I made a precarious living, partly doing some freelance, mostly translation actually, and partly teaching tango and being a teacher's assistant. It was not very grand. I was never a kind of star dancer, but I taught for an old eminence grise teacher. He was in his 80s, obese, could barely walk, let alone dance, but it was all up in here. And he used younger couples. We were already in our 40s, but younger couples to be his avatars, and to do the demonstrations for him in class. So my partner and I were among those couples for a short time, and also I was assisting another well-known, less well-known, but another well-known tango dancer with his classes. And then I also I had a very, very popular blog called Tango Addiction, and I started touring is too grand a word, but I started traveling around, and people would put me up for free and give me a little bit of payment in exchange for my doing readings from the blog, and also teaching tango history and music history. And I have an MA in Argentine history. So yeah, that was my life in Argentina.
Right.
A lot of dancing.
Yeah, that sounds kind of like a blessed living, even if you obviously weren't making a ton of money, but that's not the most important thing, right? It sounds like a beautiful time.
Yeah, it was lovely. It was intense and lovely in many ways. It was also, I think that not making a ton of money is fine, but making that little money is extremely stressful and anxiety provoking. And
making enough to have somewhere to live and enough to eat is a good thing.
Yes,
I believe studies have shown that happiness correlates with money only up to the point where you can afford to live in a basic kind of a way, and after that the correlation gets weaker and weaker as you get more and more money. So money makes you happy up to a limited extent.
Well, it still makes you happier the richer you get, but you have diminishing returns.
That's
so
right.
What you said before, the correlation's weaker, but there's still some correlation.
Yeah, I think that I hate to be that guy, but I think the original studies where the correlation dropped off steeply have not replicated. So I think people's reported happiness does continue to increase with more money, but there is a point of diminishing returns.
Yeah.
But I think it's also stability of income, which is important. So teaching dance is one of the most precarious ways of earning your living. Freelance in general is lumpy. So sometimes you have no work and you have no money, and you are having some sleepless nights about whether you'll be able to pay rent or will get evicted. And that's very unpleasant. And then you will have some months where you are offered a lot of work and you are just working constantly, and you feel also extremely stressed because you're just very, very overworked, but you can't say no to anything because you don't know what lean times might be coming around the corner. Yeah. So I did find it intense and also in some ways very stressful. And really in about 2017, I was I think 48 or 49 by that time. And I really felt like I didn't want to do this anymore. And I also really wanted to go to India. And it coincided with long story short, but being able to relinquish my Pakistani citizenship. So finally I could go to India. And I went for 2 years in total, kind of on and off, 1 year fully, and then a year in bits. And that was life-changing. And I came back and I decided to stop being a professional dancer. I looked for some other work. I started working at a company called Letter, which was a small startup where they had letter exchanges with famous people online, and I was employed to write letters to these people and to draw them out. The most successful, my favorite one, at least that I did, was with Thomas Chatterton Williams. I had a long correspondence with him. That was a lovely job. Unfortunately, that company went bust. And I also started writing for Substack, doing various freelance things. I started freelancing as a copy editor for Areo magazine. And then when Helen Pluckrose decided to leave Areo, she handed Areo over to me, and I ran the magazine for a couple of years, and then I joined Quillette. Sorry, you didn't need all of that info at once.
No,
but...
that's all. That's exactly what I wanted. So there's so many things to pick up there. I mean, maybe let's start with the letter thing, because I do remember that now, but I'm getting a bit confused, because was that the same company that did sort of, it was almost kind of to sort of depolarize people, right? That you'd have this sort of civilized exchange of letters. Was that
right.
the same series?
Yes.
Yeah, so
that's right.
That was quite big for a while, wasn't it? Online.
Yeah, it was a lovely project, and there were a few chances of getting it funded. We were finalists in the Y Combinator, the funding competition in 2019 or something, or 2018, but we didn't get it. And in the end, it was run by Clyde and Dane Rathbone. In the end, they didn't get funding, and it was bought by Substack. So now
okay.
It supposedly at some point in the future it will be part of Substack, but Substack have not yet.
So the concept
done
is
anything with it.
The concept was that people would write letters to famous people they disagreed with about something. James mentioned reduction of polarization. So
yeah,
what was the concept there?
There was several concepts. One was that just people could write letters to each other publicly on the platform, and we had a matchmaking service, which I wasn't involved in, but where they would find people that you could write to if you wanted to write about a specific topic, and then also
a kind of intellectual Tinder.
Yeah. And then also that famous people would have letter exchanges with each other. So I think we had one with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, or some duo of that kind, a few duos of that kind who wrote letters to each other on the platform. And then also there were some people who were kind of more or less interviewed by me, but in this extremely extensive way, as a long letter conversation. So quite hard to describe. The one I had with Thomas Chatterton Williams was based on his book, Memoir in Black and White. And we talked about race, about bridging different cultures, about our respective experiences growing up, mixed race, etc., in these quite literary and polished letter, but also very personal letters. And I did a long series also with Buster Benson, who wrote a book called Why Are We Yelling, which is about depolarization. We wrote a long series of letters to each other. I miss him, actually. Those letters became very personal and went on for months. So I also wrote some letters to Matt McManus and a few other people. So I wrote Helen Pluckrose and I had a series of letters which were about fat activism and people's struggles with respective struggles with weight and various other related topics. So that's what letter was about. And I was hired basically to lubricate the process by writing letters to some people and getting them on board that way.
Right.
So one thought that occurs to me, though, that this, when I'm reminded that this service didn't continue, and I'm thinking of Areo too, which I mentioned before, sadly sort of gone out of business, is it strikes me that particular attempt to depolarize people, and also Areo, they're both sort of very sensible kind of centrist pitches, and I wonder if those kinds of pitches actually ended up doing worse in the culture war because they weren't sort of tapping into these sort of dopaminergic systems of kind of getting people really
Yeah, I mean,
excited or angry or whatever it is, right?
the center has become a fairly hollowed out area in many ways.
Yeah,
You have more
yeah,
and more people. I mean, of course, we've seen for some years the kind of increasing intolerance on the left, and certainly now we're seeing more of that on the right as well. And we see surveys out of Pew Research and so in America that shows over time Democrats and Republicans hating one another more and more. So, I mean, I think this is something that James and I have worried about a bit. That makes running a democracy quite hard, because really a well-functioning democracy, to my mind, has its contest in the middle rather than between two highly polarized groups screaming at one another.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that it's Areo specifically was always kind of a long shot. So when Helen was running Areo, she felt a lot of ambivalence about generally her public profile, because she is a very private and introverted person, and she feels an urge to write because she has a very analytical mind, and she's also kind of an obsessive, and also she has a very clear way of explaining things which many people respond to, and a very, I think, clear sense of ethics. But she felt a lot of ambivalence about her kind of the public attention she received, because so much of it was negative, and she is a sensitive person. Well, I think you have to be not just not sensitive, but have the hide of a rhino to deal with the kinds of critiques that she got.
Yeah.
So, and not just critiques, but a lot of personal attacks.
Vicious attacks, yeah.
Yeah. So she never really tried to market Areo or use her contacts to market Areo. So it all remained quite low key. And when she handed it over to me, it was not making any money at all. In fact, she was keeping it afloat through her own personal money. And so she felt the magazine would have to be closed down, but she offered me the chance to try to keep it going if I wanted to. So I decided I would make an attempt, and I did my best. I tried to get the Patreon going, but it's really hard to fund that kind of thing through Patreon alone. And there's a vicious cycle, which is that if you don't have a lot of readers, you really can't paywall things. But if you don't paywall them, people won't pay for something that's already free. And I felt that it would have been a great idea to use the Areo brand to partner with the various free speech and heterodox organizations around, most of which didn't have their own magazine, or if they did, it was a very low-key blog, only written by one person with not many readers, kind of on their own website. And I had high hopes of that, and I approached a number of them, of those organizations. And they all said no, even though I feel I made a good case. And I said, you would reach a lot of people if you had a magazine. It would cost you a lot of money to create a magazine from scratch. And we had quite a big readership at Areo as well. So here you have eyes on your stuff. All you would need to do is basically give me a salary and a tiny bit more money to keep the magazine in business. But they all declined that idea. No one was interested. So I finally, and I got a few generous one-off donations from people. So that's what kept me going for 2 years, because I was doing it full time on no other source of income. It was rough. It was very rough. It was a lot of work for very, very, very little money. So I finally kind of decided that I would have to pull the plug. I'd eventually have to pull the plug in around February of last year. And I was here in Sydney at that time. And I was looking for another work possibility, and I thought maybe I could work at Quillette. And I should explain that I was a bit cheeky about this. There was no job advertised at Quillette. I was not invited to work at Quillette. Instead, I asked Claire Lehman if she would create a job for me. And she decided that she could, but initially only half-time. And also half times for a kind of 6-month trial period to see how we did. So I took that half-time job and I really pared Areo down, and was only doing it really once a week during that period. I was officially working half-time at Quillette, but really I was putting in an almost full-time workload, and voluntarily, right? I really wanted to get established at the magazine. So I pared it right down, and then in November of this year, before the new tax year rolled over, when I would have had a lot of expenses associated with Areo, with very little money coming in, I closed it all together. And now Quillette has bought the archive.
All right.
So this hasn't happened yet, but it will. Quillette has bought the archive of the articles and the podcast as well, the 2 for Tea podcast. So those are going to appear on the Quillette site, and they will be kind of part of Quillette. So they'll be online. They're still online at Areo, and I'm not taking them off there, but they're going to be Quillette's tech people are going to take them off and put them on Quillette's site. They'll be available there. We'll be publicizing them at Quillette when we publicize articles from our archives in the same way, and same with the podcast. And also when we have new Quillette articles that are relevant, we'll be putting the Areo articles in there. We're also going to be inviting some of the Areo people to be regular correspondents at Quillette. That's already happened with a few of the people.
So it's almost a kind of merging then.
There's a little bit of merging going on, yeah, but there's going to be no separate Areo publication.
No, I understand.
And we may also even work together. So there is an edited collection of kind of best of Areo, which I've signed a contract for at Pitchstone Publishing, and we might actually do that as a joint venture with Quillette. That's all still up in the air. Maybe I even shouldn't be saying this, but
you heard it first on Free Kiwis, folks.
I might go to NYT's push notifications from here.
So
that's the current state.
And now you're at Quillette, which is, if not the most, one of the more successful online platforms around the world in terms of independent publishers dealing in heterodox thinking.
Yes.
It was possibly one of the first to start up, and I remember when it started up, and it was very exciting. In fact, I think the first thing I read of James's was on Quillette, way back near the start of the operation, and it has been very successful. And I know that they've now moved to a kind of semi-paywall, right? Some articles you can read for free, and some are paywalled.
In general, most articles are free for the first few days and then paywalled.
Right.
But some are just permanently free. So if you go to the site, there are always articles that you can read for free. But the juicier and more topical articles, we try to put the paywall up fairly quickly. And if there's a really juicy article, we will paywall it within 24 hours to try to nudge people over. We have a lot of free subscribers. We do have some donors. No, Peter Thiel is not among our donors. People are always asking me that.
Well, a big question in New Zealand at the moment would be, are you funded by the Atlas Network?
I have no idea. I don't even know what that is.
I didn't know what that was either, but this think tank's been accused of being funded by the Atlas. It's sort of an in-joke. But
I'm sorry. Yes, the Atlas Network is an American organization that was set up to seed kind of centre-right think tanks, and there's been a bit of a flurry, I would say mostly on social media, about the New Zealand Initiative and various other New Zealand organisations who are apparently part of this dark conspiracy overseen by the the elders of the Atlas network?
So I think as I don't, I don't know all of the details, and I wouldn't be completely at kind of liberty to say. But nobody sinister is funding us, and what funding we have from donors is no strings attached. That is very clear. In general, I don't really know. I'm just not aware. And I think that more than half, and possibly quite a large majority of our funding is from individual paying subscribers. So Quillette is doing very well financially, as we deserve to.
I agree.
And for an independent publication, this is a shoestring budget industry. You're not going to make big bucks working working for an independent magazine, but we are doing well, and I'm really happy about that.
And I guess, like any especially successful publication that tries to be heterodox, there have been a few moments of controversy, I suppose, with Quillette. One being during COVID, when the magazine took a line that some people who were perhaps, avid readers and part of the heterodox scene took exception to, perceiving Quillette to be in favour of lockdowns and quite restrictive measures and so on. And then more recently, perhaps the Israel-Palestine conflict. So how do you tread that line where there are some issues where perhaps the editorial team feels you need to take a position? How do you negotiate that as a publication that prides itself on representing many points of view?
Yeah, so I think that we won't represent any point of view. We have a slant, and the slant is pro-science, pro-Western in this broadest, I don't think we would say this, but pro-Western in the broadest sense of Western values, which I consider to be values that happen to
have originated
in the West. Yeah, originated all over the place, but most recently in the West, and took hold and flourished most recently in the West, but should really be universal values.
Right.
There's nothing genetically Western about them.
Not.
It's just historical contingency.
Yeah.
But we are very much pro-Western democracies, and we are also very pro-science and technology, in favor of finding technological solutions to things. So I think that it is, we're not a conservative magazine. And
no, indeed. I remember some pretty risque articles on Quillette over the years.
Yeah, I would say that there is a wish to be non-partisan in the sense of not trying to espouse a view because we want to convince people to vote in one way or another, in most cases. Though there are a few exceptions where we think it's very obvious that people should be voting in one way rather than another. I think the only case of that I can think of is Trump. We are anti-Trump. We're anti the MAGA movement. I'm speaking for Quillette, which maybe I shouldn't, but I'll just premise that these are my kind of impressions. I would say that Quillette is very strongly pro-nuclear, which is an outlier, an increasingly popular position in Australia, but not the mainstream position.
Presumably you mean pro-nuclear power as opposed to nuclear weapons.
Yes, pro-nuclear power, yes.
It's interesting you say that. I've just watched on the plane Oliver Stone's recent documentary about nuclear now. And that's very interesting. I think one of the points he makes early on is just this stunningly obvious thing when you think about it, that people confuse nuclear power and nuclear bombs. They're actually quite different things. And it's actually a big issue in New Zealand at the moment because New Zealand is proudly sort of nuclear free. And originally I think meant we don't want nuclear subs, and we don't want to participate in that.
Well, actually, if you go back far enough, it kind of meant both.
Well, I think that's the thing I was going to say, that actually it's sort of the anti-nuclear bomb stance seems to have leaked over into the anti-nuclear power
I actually think the anti-nuclear power thing came first. The anti-nuclear weapons thing was solidified in 1984 when the government led by David Longy banned or refused to allow entry of the USS Buchanan, which may have been nuclear armed. They wouldn't confirm or deny, and under the policy that government introduced, it wasn't allowed to enter, and that caused a fissure in the ANZUS alliance between Australia, New Zealand and the US, and ever since then New Zealand has pursued a less aligned foreign policy than it had before. So that kind of became entrenched in the New Zealand psyche, I suppose, this idea that we're proud of our stance on all of that. But now, I mean, especially those who lose sleep over the impending doom of the planet because of climate change, it seems timely to consider nuclear power as a very low emissions, high yield way of generating enough power to keep us prosperous.
And a very safe one too.
Yeah.
Increasingly safe. And of course, people think of Chernobyl and they think of Fukuyama and these terrible accidents where things have gone wrong. But I think the latest generation reactors are most unlikely to have those kinds of events.
Yeah, I think just returning to Quillette, I mean, this is before I joined the magazine. So I'm just basing, these are my outsider opinions on this. But my impression is that until around 2016, or 28, in the early years of Quillette, Claire's perception was that the main threat to rational thinking was coming from the left, from leftist woke craziness. And then with Trump's election, first with Trump's election, then with vaccine denialism, the events of January 6th, and the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Claire increasingly became conscious of a threat to rationality, what we see as a threat to rationality coming from the right. I don't think we lost any of our previous enemies on the left, but we just gained a bunch of new enemies on the right.
Well, that goes to my comment before about the hollowed out middle. It is hard to maintain a kind of centrist position when everybody is rushing to the sides.
Yeah, I think it's we have been. I think Quillette hasn't lost any of its convictions, but we've stopped fighting the culture war in quite such a head-on manner, and we are more. We're sometimes doing that. We're doing some of that, but it's a less the kind of focus of Quillette, and the focus has become more making rational cases for science, technology, democracy, etc. As far as, so you asked me about editorial stances on things, and I, as a managing editor, I'm kind of taking a miniature editorial stance every week to our sponsors and paying subscribers and things, based on the articles we're publishing and what I see as the kind of I don't know, center of gravity each week that emerges. But in terms of larger editorial stances, we are, I guess, sometimes editorial stances are emerging on the basis of people's research. So we published a very long piece by Jamie Palmer, which he has been working on for almost a year, a piece with a very deeply researched piece on the lab leak theory.
Yeah, I read that one. It was very thorough. Yeah.
Which has been very controversial, and I feel that we have agreed as a magazine. I don't even think it's that important an issue, but we have agreed, really, all of us agree that we no longer think the lab leak is a credible thesis, and that's not because we have any trust whatsoever in the CCCP. But also, I think that we have all come to the conclusion that gain-of-function research is actually important, and therefore, although of course you need safeguards, we shouldn't be scaremongering about it, because it will lead to protection against many epidemics that are likely to come down the pipeline.
It's an
So in
interesting
fact,
case of culture war, that one, because
yeah,
theoretically you could be for gain-of-function research and think that the COVID originated in a lab, right? It's just that people have
yeah,
this
you could.
tendency to think, oh no, COVID originated in a lab, therefore we have to shut down all gain-of-function research. Right?
Just as you can acknowledge meltdowns at Chernobyl and Fukushima and still think that nuclear power isn't a bad idea. But
Yeah.
I mean, I guess one comment I'd make about all of this is that one of the problems is the mainstream media being censorious and trying to control narratives on things, because in my view that drives irrationality and I guess conspiracy theorization, because they
Yeah.
come across, and in fact I think sometimes they do, if not cover things up, then they're very selective in the attention that they pay to various issues. And so
Yeah.
something like the lab leak theory, which was, I mean, it certainly looked very plausible at the outset, because here you had Wuhan with a gain-of-function lab, and that was obviously where the virus had emanated from. And there were some people saying that there were certain markers on the virus that made it look as if it had been human manufactured.
Or the furin cleavage
and
sites.
of course, if we took a proper scientific approach, then we'd debate all of that, and there'd be an open debate where people could present evidence on either side. And you know, one of the things about science is that you don't reach ultimately hard conclusions. Things remain contestable, and then you allow the kind of thinking to develop through debate and comparison of ideas. But when you have an active suppression of one side or the other, the people who are suppressed quite rightly get angry, and then they suspect cover-ups, whether they're really cover-ups or just somebody trying to shut down a narrative, and then they start to generate all kinds of conspiratorial ideas about why that has happened.
Yeah, I think one of the crucial things is to avoid sort of buzzwords, sloganizing, also snark. So we try to keep our articles, mostly there's a very occasional kind of more memoir-like article that we have that's a little snarky, but in general, Quillette's articles are snark-free. So that kind of, those sort of, I find them kind of rather pathetic attempts to close off debate by already saying in your description of the question what you think about it and what all right-minded people should think about it. You know, that kind of hectoring tone. So I think it's very important to avoid that. And it's very important to be able to discuss any topic at all, including very controversial topics, in a quite calm way, which is just looking at facts. And even if it's not completely clear what the facts are, you can discuss the theories, the hypotheses.
Well, that's when it becomes even more important, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think Quillette has done that very successfully with some very controversial topics like race and IQ linkages. Either there is a link there or there isn't, and whether there is or isn't is going to be completely independent of how I might feel about it, how convenient it might be to me, how kind of what kind of moral posturing I can do on either side, either, you know, I'm a very non-racist good person, so I think it couldn't possibly be, or on the other side, which is I'm a person who just believes in the truth. This view is unpopular, therefore I'm right because I hold this view, and I'm kind of just above the kind of plebs. I'm more,
you've got special knowledge.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. The conspiracy theorist
on
view,
that
right?
on that question, actually, it's not quite as simple as is it true or is it not, because there are
there
are different explanations about why it could be true. One of which has nothing directly to do with race, which is that it's actually a socioeconomic correlate, for example.
There are many, there are many hypotheses there, but it's kind of. I think it's important not to close down topics before you begin by already announcing, which so many papers do, even in their headlines, the view that they think you should take. And not just the view they take, but the view they think you should take. I think as far as editorial stances are concerned, sometimes we do release an actual editorial, occasionally, signed by all of us, which is not an article, it's just, this is our view. I think that sometimes there are kind of stances that you can tell from the magazine that we all take. And in some cases, we've even had explicit discussion. We are all pro-Ukraine and anti-Putin. I mean, I think that is just obvious and has never been, to my knowledge, discussed.
Well, it seems obvious to anybody who prefers freedom to tyranny. And
yeah, precisely. Also, we did have a discussion of, we did take a kind of editorial decision to take a quite strongly pro-Israel stance. I think we had that editorial discussion very early on, about 9th or 10th of October. I commissioned Benny Morris to be a regular correspondent on the history of the conflict. He is considered very, very left-wing in Israel and considered to be pretty sympathetic to the Palestinian side, but nevertheless, he is certainly not one of the free Palestine from the river to the sea types at all. So I felt that he was, and he is very, very, very detailed and factual in his accounts of things. So I feel he was a very trustworthy voice to have as our kind of authority. And we're very careful about who we're commissioning to write on that these are people who are not just spouting off an opinion, but who have credentials and expertise. But yeah, we are taking a very pro-Israel stance in this conflict. We did publish, I commissioned a piece by Ali Rizvi, which is about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and Ali is taking a much more pro-Palestinian stance on this. Obviously not a pro-Hamas stance, but a much more pro-Palestinian stance, much more anti-Israel and anti-IDF stance. That's fine. But we have taken a very pro-Israel stance at the magazine. We kind of agreed on that. We also have taken a strongly pro-free speech stance, and one of the editorials we published was Let Palestine Supporters Have Their Say, it's titled, and it's about shutting down of pro-Palestine groups at universities, etc.
Oh, great.
And a peaceful protest.
I mean, that's always really important to me as a huge supporter of free speech. In times at which free speech seems to be, for whatever reason, associated with one political side or another, when an opportunity comes along to defend the free speech of the other side, you have to grab it with both hands, because that's a good opportunity to show that it cuts both ways, right?
Yeah.
So maybe the last thing we could speak about, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, is social media, actually, because when you were talking about trying to avoid sloganeering, which I agree that Quillette generally does quite well, I think one of the disturbing features of this period, the culture wars or whatever you want to call it, is that you kind of got used to seeing these sort of formally sensible and even quite sort of boring institutions kind of tweet out this sort of rabidly kind of emotional stuff and all these slogans, all trans women or whatever it is, Black Lives Matter. It's not so much the sort of sentiment in each case that disturbs me. I mean, sometimes I agree with them. It's more just the sort of lack of consideration and the sort of emotional tone. And I get that a lot from Twitter now, X. That I think for some reason it's one of the worst ones. And actually, I went on to Instagram maybe a couple of years now, and I noticed, I mean, at first on Instagram, I thought, well, what's the point? It's just pictures, right? I care more about words than pictures. But actually, you can kind of write as much as you want, or you can write a lot anyway. But I noticed about Instagram that it doesn't have the same kind of virality, right? People don't kind of Insta in the same way as you can retweet, and that seems to kind of limit it. So I guess you're someone who I think is very good at social media and adept at kind of tapping into it, but also is kind of eminently reasonable on it. So yeah, what are your thoughts about how that's affected the culture war and where that's going?
Yeah, I think that one problem is that journalists are using social media has allowed them to quote a very small numbers of people as if they were representative, and this is really inflaming to the culture wars. So, for example, I'm a big Star Trek fan, so this is something that I noticed. There was a kerfuffle over Star Trek fans who were angry at the lead actress in one of the new shows being a Black woman, and when you actually dived into the articles, it was 4 accounts on Twitter with a total following of under 100 between them. And so this kind of feeling that people are thinking this, either for good things, either, this must be true because people are saying, people are criticizing, or for bad things. Oh, there are many racists because people are thinking this and saying this. And the people who are allegedly thinking and saying the stuff, who are being cited as the Vox Populi, are often a really small number of accounts on Twitter. So I find that extremely lazy journalism and very, very annoying. I think that there clearly is a polarizing effect on Twitter, but I actually think that I feel that of all the platforms, Twitter is the best and the least polarizing. And I feel the reason for that is that it's more difficult to curate your audience. So you always get people giving you pushback when you say things on Twitter. And some of the pushback is really rude and nasty and uncalled for, but some of it is really useful. I find it very useful. I like to think aloud on Twitter, and I often get very good pushback from people, which genuinely changes my mind about things. So I feel there's a lot of freedom, and also people are no bullshit on Twitters, which is why I can't stand a platform like LinkedIn. It's just incredible bullshit.
Do you mean people waffling or?
Yeah, also just saying, lots of business slogans and business needs, which is just nonsense. And also, everything is a great opportunity and everyone is wonderful.
All that. It's a kind of glorified CV, isn't it? So
it is. And it's like most CVs, it's also just exaggerated bollocks, self-aggrandizing bollocks. And then I feel that I know youngsters are not using Facebook so much, but Facebook and Instagram, or whatever the young people are using, I don't know.
TikTok, right?
At 54, it's a long way off. TikTok, maybe. They've probably moved on to something new, which I don't even know about. That kind of, on those platforms, a lot of people are talking to real life or potentially real life friends, relatives, and things. And the platforms, you can't discuss politics on there as a result, or it gets extremely toxic very fast. So I have watched people's friendships and even relationships break up in real time in the Facebook comment section. So I feel that there is a sort of safety in Twitter because of its anonymity and heterodoxy, which inevitably goes along with some people trolling, but I don't know that Twitter is really. I would need to see more evidence to be convinced that Twitter is a force for polarization, because I think it can go both ways.
You make a very good point about it. The lack of curatability of the audience is an important aspect of that. You get exposed to pushback whether you like it or not. Now, ideally, of course, a lot of it wouldn't be so heated and so vitriolic and so on, because I do think that makes people entrench rather than think about what the other person is saying.
Of course.
But having said that, just living in an echo chamber drives you further into the echo chamber. I think probably the biggest problem from my perspective with Twitter is the brevity of the messages, which tends to lead to, it's more difficult to express things in a nuanced way, and people tend to sloganeer a lot and perhaps grandstand a lot.
Yeah, I like the brevity of messages though, because it prevents that kind of your crazy uncle after 6 beers writing a really long screed with no paragraph breaks phenomenon. That is,
so that's the good writer in you coming out.
And it encourages sloganeering, grandstanding, all those kinds of things, and performative stuff. But it also does encourage conversation, because conversation does take place in smaller bites like that. So on the whole, I like it, actually.
I quite like the way it lends itself to, or it should lend itself to, kind of discrete arguments. Like you can say, like, this is the stage of the argument that we're focusing on now, and people can attack that or whatever. You can retweet that, and then you can move on. You have another discrete argument. I think that's actually quite helpful philosophically.
I think it's really helpful. And also I feel that a lot of people in real life are in echo chambers of their own choosing, because it's in real life, it's very dangerous to disagree with, can be very dangerous to disagree with people on politics.
Which is why people are more civil about it.
They self-censor, which is both good and bad. They rightly value their friendships and relationships over, being right about politics. So they avoid, most people are fairly agreeable and they avoid those kinds of arguments. Or they're afraid of being rejected, or they're just kind of naturally gravitating to people who hold the same opinions as them. My ex-boyfriend, who is an academic and really very much on the woke leftist side of things, well, he might characterize it differently, but so you'll have to take my word for it.
It's quite unusual for people to describe themselves as woke in my experience.
Yeah, I see him as being on the woke left. He's an academic and that is his milieu. And he's kind of aware that other opinions exist, but he hasn't really in real life come across the more reasonable versions of those arguments. Because the only people he's heard pushing back have been people who are motivated to push back because they feel very strongly. So they're motivated to push back even though it's going to cause trouble. And those people often also have more extreme opinions. So I think he was quite shocked and alienated by my opinions because he had just never encountered this in the wild, in real life. And I think that I'm sure that other people he knows agree with me. In fact, kind of know that some other people he knows agree with me, but these people are very agreeable and they don't push back because they don't feel it's not worth having an argument. In real life, other things take priority.
Well, if they're academics as well, I mean, there's evidence that they're worried about their careers. I mean, people report that in surveys.
In many cases, probably.
I mean, I'd love to say that I'm shocked. I'd love to say that I'm shocked that an academic would, be like that, but I'm not shocked. I think it's appalling that the universities have got to the state they have, where
I agree.
Academics who ought to be embrace disagreement. And when I was trained as a scientist, we certainly embraced disagreement. We were exposed to some fairly heated disagreement that never got personal, but it could get heated. And it was excellent training because you get used to being around your ideas being rigorously challenged. And there is no doubt that improved me as a scientist. And it also inculcated the habit of wanting to have that contest. So.
Yeah, I felt very kind of annoyed during the campaign here in Australia for the Indigenous Voice to Parliament, which is, part of the problem with the campaign was it was never quite clear exactly what it was, but let's say it was for a constitutional advisory body of Indigenous representatives to advise on Australian legislation. And there was a yes campaign, no campaign. Oh, that's fine, right? The universities all put out all of them that I know of, put out an official statement saying that they were voting yes, that at our university, we support the yes campaign. They put up banners and posters all over campus, etc. And I don't mind I don't mind the fact of anybody having supported the yes campaign. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with individual academics supporting it. Maybe even most academics supported it. Probably, academia is always going to have a left-wing bias, and that's fine. But I did not think the university should take an official stance on questions like this. I feel universities should represent all Australians, maybe not those at the most extreme ends, but the broad spectrum of Australian opinion should be acceptable at a university. And where there are disagreements, you should be discussing those disagreements, and you should be interested in exploring, not in shutting down exploration by beginning by declaring what everybody's stance and position at the university should be.
Well, you
That
can't be a
seems to me to be
university if you do
anathema.
that. You don't
Yeah,
deserve the title university, because if you're a university, it's a venue for the contest of ideas. And if
yeah,
you predetermine the answer to a question by saying this university thinks this or that, then at least in that context, you are not behaving like a university.
And in these cases, I mean, it's very seldom the case that they actually have a process for arriving at the institutional view, right? It's very seldom that they say, let's have a debate and then we're going to have a vote. Like if something like that was going on, maybe it's a bit more arguable, but it's usually the sort of maybe the Diversicrats or just the Vice Chancellor. I mean, we had cases in New Zealand, well, one where Vice Chancellor of Massey University deplatformed the speaker because she disagreed with his views. And they found the emails were gotten at by a Freedom of Information request. And in the email, she basically says, "Oh no, we're a Treaty of Waitangi-led university," which is a kind of New Zealand sort of. It's an important treaty between Maori and the Crown, but it's often interpreted by university officials as sort of being a sort of anti-racist standard, I suppose you could say.
An imperative to decolonize the curriculum and everything else.
It's taken to mean lots of things which arguably are not there in the text. But anyway, for me, it was just a perfect example of how it was really just one person who decided that the Treaty of Waitangi or their commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi meant that they had to stop the speaker. And we had a letter to a magazine, The Listener, about Maori traditional lore and science. And that caused a huge hullabaloo. And again, we had a vice chancellor who came out and said, we're dismayed at the hurt and dismay that this letter has caused. And it seemed to be speaking on behalf of the university. So I think that the people at the top of the university just need to be much more careful and realize that, they're not the only person in the university. There are all these other people too that you're actually speaking for.
Yeah, and you really silence them when you, right from the get-go, say, this is our official view. I think that also, I mean, I feel very similarly about while I'm critiquing my hopefully adoptive country, I'm also don't think it's the way that the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is handled is good at all. That's a taxpayer-funded institution, and again, I feel that it should be representing the views of a broad spectrum of Australians. Let's say most Australians, like not views that fall within 95% of Australians. I don't expect them to be representing the views of, I don't know, neo-Nazis or out and out Marxists or some extreme, Stalinists, some extreme end of the spectrum. But most Australians, at least half of Australians are right-leaning and support the Liberal Party. And you would not know that from the ABC. There were 2 radio programs, I'm not really aware of too many others, which had a more heterodox bent, a more centrist, mildly right-leaning in one case, and in the other case, a more heterodox leftist stance. And even in the titles, you can tell that they frame them as being going against the grain of the rest of the ABC's programming. So they were called Counterpoint and Uncomfortable Conversations. Full disclosure, I was on both those shows, and I know the hosts in both cases. But both, I don't know why those shows have been shut down. And I'm not suggesting that they were shut down in order to cancel or censor the opinions on those shows, because I don't know, could have been for financial or many other programming, many other reasons. But both those shows have gone now, and there is nothing. And I just feel this is unconscionable. Like they're not doing their job.
It's self-destructive in the long run, because if they're taxpayer funded and enough taxpayers for long enough get the idea that they're not serving them, then they'll be less willing to vote for people who want to continue that funding.
Absolutely. And also, I think that there's a real problem when you don't have, when people don't perceive the mainstream news services as reliable or as unbiased, then they turn to other sources, and those sources are often unvetted. And very often those are individuals, autodidacts with their own YouTube channels and podcasts and things like that, who, and some of those people are really good, very well informed and excellent, Um,
Well, like Free
and
Kiwis, for example.
yeah, for
And
example, this.
and Quillette actually is independent too, right? So
Right.
some of them do a
Yeah,
good job,
yeah.
but yeah.
Some of them do a good job,
Uh,
but some of them are also some of these self-taught people. The problem is that their ideas are not stress tested because they are speaking only to their own paying audience, and they are also audience captured because they're really dependent for their livelihood on not offending that audience, and so they can be. You can get into a kind of uh, into another heterodox echo chamber of cranks.
True. Although I mean, I would say institutions like the ABC, with which I have some familiarity, is in an echo chamber of its own, maybe for different
Yeah.
reasons, but
Yeah.
it is certainly no more heterodox, or no its ideas are no better stress tested than some of these other platforms. I mean, for sure, you can find platforms all over the loony spectrum, but
Yeah.
I'm not at all convinced that publicly funded ones that are state broadcasters, whether it's in Australia, New Zealand, or the UK or America, are any more rigorous in their presentation of material than at least a lot of the independent ones are.
Yeah, I think they're less rigorous in many ways, and we saw that at the beginning of the Israel-Gaza conflict. That some of the reporting, I was kind of proud and also slightly appalled that Quillette was better fact checked than the New York Times. I think that it's no, they're no more heterodox, and they should be. They should be. That should be part of your remit as the state broadcaster.
all right, so we've come to the conclusion that people should really read Quillette and Free Kiwi and listen to Free Kiwis, and well, obviously
Yes.
listen to lots. I think the real conclusion is listen to a broad range of voices, and hopefully, I mean, we've tried a little bit at least to like get different voices on, people who are sort of heterodox and free speechy, and people from the other side of the aisle as well. So, and I know Quillette does that too. I mean, even in the COVID period, I mean, people said, "Oh, you're never publishing anything against lockdowns," but I remember reading a piece by Toby Young, which was explicitly against lockdowns. So yeah, and, so we'll link to the Palmer article because it is a very good article against the lab leak hypothesis, and some other articles that you mentioned. But for now, thank you so much for coming on to Free Kiwis, Iona.
Thank you indeed.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you.